All right. Welcome back to the No Greater Joy podcast. This is, what are we at, episode 5, and I'm excited about what we have planned. But it's brought to you from by the pastors at Grace Baptist Church, who all of us have a heart and desire for our people to know greater joy and to follow Jesus and to love him with their whole heart. And my name is Steve Strong, lead pastor here. We got
Ryan Adkins serving in the Timothy position.
Andreas Bailey, serving as the associate pastor.
And we are convinced that there is no greater joy than when God's people step into the 3 areas that we want to focus on here at Grace: being a 24/7 worshiper, being a go person, and being an alongsider. And I'm excited because this episode, we've talked about wanting to have some guests, and we have our very first guest with us, and gonna really kind of hope that his heart spills over into the hearts of our people. And I'm happy to have Jonathan with us. He is no stranger to the people at Grace. I think you filled the pulpit at least twice for us, and he's been a guest speaker on some of our weekend seminars. And so, Jonathan, really glad that you're with us. Glad that you're here.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely, our pleasure and our joy. So just want a couple questions. Obviously, there's going to be some people that maybe aren't familiar with who John is, who your family is. Why don't you just take a minute, tell us about yourself, about your family, and maybe how you came to know Jesus Christ.
Yeah, sure.
That'd be a good way to start.
So I'm going to go way back to my early years, and my early years were spent in Hartville, if you guys know where that is, just between Akron and Canton.
Hartville Kitchen is all that I know about the Hartville.
The Hartville Kitchen is there,
right.
Yeah, and we would visit that
Food.
frequently. It's
Delicious.
actually, it was a town that was initially predominantly Amish and former Amish, like in the Mennonite community.
Mm-hmm.
And so my dad was the principal at the, what was the name of the Lake Center Christian School. And so I grew up in a Christian home. Interestingly, even though my dad was the principal, they homeschooled us.
Oh, interesting.
And so we did not realize how progressive my parents really were at the time. I mean, we were doing home birthing way before that was popular in the 2000s. We were doing organic, growing our own food, raising goats, the whole 9 yards.
Wow.
You were
all in.
We were all in. As kids, we were thoroughly embarrassed by some of my parents' eccentricities, and now, like 30 years later, all these things are the rage in California and stuff. So it's
cool now.
Kind of funny. They are, yeah. We joke about it a lot now, how our parents were ahead of their time. But so grew up in a Christian family. My parents loved the Lord. They had come to Christ in Campus Crusade when they were in college in their early 20s, and so they were passionate. They were all in, and shared the gospel with us. I accepted Christ when I was 8. I distinctly remember being angry with my older brother and sister about something and just feeling this sense of anger and resentment and even hatred towards them as a result of this conflict. And it was into that moment that my mom really spoke to me about how Christ could cleanse me of that anger and wash me and cleanse me of my sin through his death and resurrection. And there was a real sense of conviction of sin in that moment, and a real awareness that it was only through Christ that I could be cleansed. And so I trusted Christ at 8, and then grew in my faith. Later we moved to Akron. I attended Cuyahoga Valley Christian Academy as a high school student and continued growing in my faith there. I remember when I was 14 or 15, I went through a serious time of depression, and that was really one of the first bouts of depression I had experienced, although that honestly has been a lifelong reality for me. I just tend to struggle in that way with melancholy, I guess you could say, or introspection. And it was a season of depression, and I remember as a 14-year-old just kind of looking down all the different trajectories of life, and the different pursuit of success, pursuit of wealth, pursuit of pleasure, pursuit of all these different pursuits, and just it was almost as if the Holy Spirit gave me the foresight to see that all of those were ultimately going to be dead ends, and that there was really no meaning in life and to life apart from our Creator and our Redeemer. And so that, I would say that kind of the gospel sunk even deeper to me at that point in my life. When I entered college, I went to the University of Akron. As perhaps many college students can struggle with it. You're just confronted with a lot of freedom and some significant choices, about how you're going to live. And it was in that context that even though I was in some ways walking with the Lord, I made some significant mistakes. And that was a season where the gospel came to be even more precious to me, because I think the way I look at it is there's the story of Jesus, and the adulterer is thrown down before him, and the religious leaders are about to stone her, and Jesus says, "He who is without sin cast the first stone." And I think up until that point, as this little kind of sometimes self-righteous Christian kid, I often would identify with either the religious leaders tempted to judge people, or Jesus challenging others to extend mercy. But it was the first time that I actually saw my own depravity, and that I was the adulterer, that I had no righteousness, no purity, no goodness to give to God. And it wasn't just an issue of God being kind of fortunate to have this talented kid on his team. It was like, no, I was the one that had nothing to bring him. And yet he was coming to me in mercy and grace and to give me a new purpose. And so that there have been those different moments in my life where I feel like the truths that I heard as a kid have become more precious.
Wow, praise God just for faithful families, your parents. That's thankful for just parents who love the Lord, grandparents in my case who love the Lord. We tend to think maybe those are there's no story there. That's what a tribute. So praise God for that.
Mm-hmm.
Now you're married.
Yes,
right?
I am.
You are married. Tell us
Yes.
about your family now.
Yes, my wife Megan and I have been married for 14 years in May, and we have 3 children, Jude, Elijah, and Eden. Their ages 10, 8, and 5.
Great.
So they're a gift to us.
So you're busy.
We are busy. Yes, we are busy. But it's, I would say, like, I have a friend who they just had their 3rd child, and they're in that kind of like 5, 3, and 0 phase. And I was like, dude,
You're insane.
you're in the weeds right now.
Yeah.
You're just from a physical and emotional standpoint. I found that season to be really exhausting.
Yep.
And now that my kids they're in school, actually they attend here, Westside Christian Academy, and it's kind of like we're sending them off each day, and there's a little bit more breathing room, I think. But
Just different. It's busy in different ways in all the different stages.
yes,
But joys nonetheless.
yes, absolutely.
So tell us a little bit about your ministry and how you came to that ministry, and I don't know, just give us a little bit of history of that.
Yeah. Well, I was kind of always interested in cross-cultural things. I mean, even as a kid, I was a little odd. I remember being like a 10-year-old kid in our small farm in Hartville, and when we would play kind of the whole Cowboys and Indians thing, I always identified with the Indians more than the Cowboys. So I'm not sure. That should have been a warning sign that I was headed for something cross-cultural as an adult. But even as a high schooler, I was thinking of moving out and doing work on Indian reservations. So there was a burden for cross-cultural work. But in college, I was involved in a very dynamic college ministry in Akron through the chapel in Akron, and we took short-term trips throughout the year, and they were taking trips overseas. So one year we were traveling to China. The next year we were traveling to Turkey. And I got a chance to participate in those, and I remember very distinctly, I think I've shared this story with some of your folks before, but where I was driving through a mountain pass in Turkey, and we were looking down over this city of about 500,000 people, and hearing them say, to the best of our knowledge, we're not aware of a single believer and in the city. And that just really struck a chord with me. Like the Lord just kind of drove that into my heart about that. And a phrase that a lot of missionaries will use is that all people are equally lost without Christ, but not all people are equally unreached. And that there's certain realities. I remember coming home, and at the time we were still using the big old phone books, which I think are pretty much obsolete now. But I remember going through the yellow pages, and in Akron, where I was living at the time, there were 14 yellow pages of churches in Akron.
Wow.
Akron's not 500,000 people. Granted, probably a decent percentage of those maybe had lost the gospel in some sense, but there was still a gospel presence where it was being proclaimed, where people had coworkers, neighbors, cousins, family, friends, someone who knew the gospel. But in these countries, particularly in the 1040 window, there wasn't the opportunity. Like if someone had a curiosity even about what do Christians truly believe, there was really very little opportunity for them to get answers. Interestingly, I think that's one of the amazing things about the internet. And you just see how even in the broad scope of history, I really believe that the internet and just international travel by plane, you jump on a plane and you're on the other side of the world in 12 hours, that God is using that for the sake of the spread of the gospel to give people access that never have had access before. But that was a real moment for me there in Turkey. And I remember I was just ready to drop out of college and just move. Yeah. And I remember our contact there saying, no, finish your degree. Don't rush this. And then there are probably Turkish students at the University of Akron. And so I came back, and the Lord opened the door for me to build relationships with some Turkish students there, some of then other additional Muslim students. And that was a point where I really developed a burden specifically for Muslim peoples, and was really ready to go, and ended up getting my master's degree while in Akron through a Trinity extension site there, in hopes of going to the mission field, but then realizing that I just didn't have the maturity, the spiritual maturity. I didn't have the pastoral training, and I just didn't feel like I had I was ready to pursue going abroad. And so ended up staying in the States. But years later, the Lord kind of reopened that opportunity through students at Tri-C and building relationships with some conversation partners there. And this would have been back in, my wife and I had been married for about 5 years at this point. We were still open and interested in serving internationally or internationals, but we didn't know how. And that's when I formed a relationship with Tri-C, where I was a conversation partner to help students practice English, and asked for Middle Eastern students specifically. And they said, how many do you want? We're being completely overrun, so to speak, with all these students from Saudi Arabia. And so this was back in 2012, and it really was a point where I felt like the Lord said, this is what I'm calling you to right now. So I began building relationships with the Saudi guys, having no idea what I was getting into. Most of us remember 9/11, and seeing flashes on television of the Muslim world celebrating 9/11, particularly from these really hardcore places like Saudi Arabia. And so I still remember sitting down with my first Saudis and saying, not initially, not in the first conversation, but asking them, what is your take on 9/11? What were you guys celebrating, or were you mourning? I just had no idea. There was kind of like this wall of their cultural experience that was completely separate from my own, and that was just opened up a beautiful season really for us over the last 8 years of investing our lives in particularly in Saudi students, but then in joining international friendships in 2015, going full-time vocationally in international student ministry and interacting with a lot of other nationalities as well. So
you got some?
I was just going to ask, what was your undergrad major?
So I was
or majors.
I was very indecisive.
Me too, brother.
Yeah. And I changed like 5 times, and
Amen.
yeah, was there for 6 years, and actually loved most of my college youth. I loved all 6 years of it, as crazy as that sounds. But
It was that way for kindergarten with me.
really,
It was great. All
and
6
then
years
it went
of
downhill
kindergarten.
from
That's right.
for all 6 years.
of kindergarten. Yeah.
I ended up with a degree in English with
Okay.
a focus on teaching English as a second language.
Okay, cool.
Thinking I was eventually going to go overseas. I also spent a significant amount of time studying the performing arts.
Oh, okay.
And I studied theater. I studied dance, believe it or not, and loved it.
Mm-hmm.
And I had never done any of the performing arts until college. So my minor, believe it or not, is in dance.
Okay.
I might be the first dude that you've met that can say that, but it was an amazing experience. I loved it.
So I think we just added a question and element here to the podcast of show us your best move.
Yep.
Maybe. No, I'm kidding.
Dude,
We
I'm
have-
taking that man on my team if we're doing Dance Revolution.
All right.
Well, the crazy thing is I'm terrible at like social dancing, like
Oh,
at
man.
weddings
But
and
choreographed?
weddings and everything like that. I have no idea what I'm doing. I feel embarrassed. I feel awkward, just probably like everybody else.
But if it's choreographed, you kill
But
it.
yeah, if there's another side to dance, which if you talk to a lot of dancers, they'll tell you that it's actually a love of music that moves them to want to dance, and they love music. They love getting inside the music just with their bodies physically, and so yeah.
Can I? This isn't on here, so you talked about. It seemed your college years was obviously you're exploring. It seems, your time in Turkey. Don't rush. You felt like you weren't ready. Get your degree, but you still had. It seems that growing desire, that fire for international ministry, for ministry. What would you tell to any of our college students, high school students, or even adults maybe that are like feeling like that desire, but not feeling either ready or not rushing. Someone who is like still trying to figure out, I have this desire, but I don't know where to go with it, or whatever. I don't know if you could. I don't know how you handled that, or if you look back at that time, what did you learn, and what would you say to someone maybe in the same position that you were in?
Well, I've kind of heard over the years 2 different visions for how this kind of transition into missions happens, and even what is the most strategic way to engage in missions.
Sure.
So you have some people that are just like, everybody go. I don't care if you're 16, 18, 20, 80, go to the Unreached, And then on the other hand, there's people that say, wait a second, what is really most needed, and what we see with like Paul, for example, being sent out. They sent out the cream of the crop, and they sent out someone who had a very clear calling to this ministry, cross-cultural work, and that was in a position to kind of plant churches and disciple individuals into maturity, like future elders. And so those are 2 very different visions kind of for what missions looks like. And I think especially in my 20s, and I think I still lean in this direction, I really saw the benefit of the kind of vision of sending out the Pauls. And so when I thought about going out and planting a church, discipling potentially future church leaders, mentoring pastors, I was a 23-year-old kid. I wasn't ready to mentor a pastor, And even though I had been working at a church, at the chapel, which was a mega church, in a mega church, you end up getting kind of pigeonholed into a particular role where you're really good at it, but you don't get as much of the broader pastoral experience of walking with people through suffering, walking with people through death, through the miscarriages, through marriage counseling, through challenges with their children, through all those struggles in life. As a 23-year-old focusing on creative arts, which is what I was doing at the chapel, I just realized like I'm not ready for that. I'm not ready for a broad to mentor pastors, basically. So that was what gave me pause. And I also think that I felt it in my own soul. There was enough of a temptation towards sin and throwing myself into a lifestyle of sin that I knew if I were removed from just kind of the general network of family, of friends, of support, to having complete anonymity in a foreign city where it's kind of like you could do whatever you want. No one's going to know. I just realized there might be 99% chance of the time that I have the self-control and the discipline to do what's right, but I felt there was a vulnerability within me. And so that's one of the things where I've come to really value team ministry, and I see why Jesus sent people out 2 by 2, and I see why Paul traveled with a whole team. Jesus traveled with a team. Like the whole Lone Ranger thing is very prevalent within people who are willing to go cross-culturally, but I think it's very dangerous. And so those are some of the reasons that gave me pause.
So what would you encourage maybe a high school student or a college student who has kind of those desires but has no idea what to do, where they don't feel ready or whatever? How would you encourage them?
That's tricky because some people kind of, I think, lean towards saying, oh, just live life a little bit, mature, grow in your faith. I think there's really a benefit to kind of exploring and taking steps under the guidance of your pastor, other experienced missionaries about what does this look like? What is life really on the ground like? And so maybe there's opportunities to travel overseas or cross-culturally for a month or something, or 3 months. You want to get a little bit out of that honeymoon phase because as one guy said, Jesus is glorious, missions is not glorious. Yeah. But we sometimes want to present it that way, and sometimes initially it feels that way. But I think anybody who's been in the trenches for a while say that some of that, the rose-colored glasses eventually come off, and you realize there is some suffering that is involved. And that's true for all Christians, actually. But so I think, gain exposure, and there's, so, find some missionaries whom you respect that would be willing to give you some exposure to their work and allow you to participate in that. But also, I think it's helpful to have a practical skill. So I think the missionary was dead on when he said, go home and get your degree. More and more in the creative access countries, it's really helpful if you have a practical skill and training and expertise in an area. And then also another thing I'd say is make sure that you are living a gospel-centered life here and now, and not imagining that by getting on that plane and going overseas that it's somehow going to change who you are. Yep. And find if you're not in a discipling relationship here, if you're not seeking to disciple others and share your faith with others, that needs to start here. Yep. And that's actually one thing I love about what we do with international students is because we can give local Americans who have a vision for cross-cultural ministry to actually kind of the opportunity to begin stretching a little bit and growing into building some of these potentially discipleship relationships right here without even needing to go.
Yep. I think that's great. Just encouraging, don't just wait for the opportunity in the future. Step into those areas where you are now, whatever it is that you're doing in your church discipleship. And we're fortunate to have so many viable ministries outside of the local churches to be able to volunteer and to step in to get exposure in ministry. Take those steps. And I think that's a good segue to international friendships, friends. Tell us a little bit about that ministry in particular. You didn't start it, you stepped into it. What was it that kind of drew you to it? So just tell us a little bit what that looks like, because it's all kind of right here in Cleveland. At least your ministry is in Cleveland here, so right?
Right, yeah, it's actually International Friendships, Inc.
Inc.
And the Inc. is for In the Name of Christ.
Not incorporated.
Right. So
perfect.
So some people are like, what is, you say IFI, what does the I
Mind
stand for?
blown.
Yeah.
That's great.
Good.
That's awesome.
It's not just there for legal protection.
Yeah.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And honestly, if it were up to me, I'd try to just drop the ink because everybody's like, what does that mean? But,
yeah.
Yeah, so, I think it was in the 1980s and 90s, there was a significant rise in international students coming to the U.S., especially from countries like China, to gain higher education. And so there was a response in Cleveland, as there is around the country, of Christians saying, okay, what do we do about this? This is a unique opportunity. How do we rise to the occasion? And so from what I understand, a man named Tom Wright and his wife, Tom attended, I think at the time, Cuyahoga Valley Church, but they said we need to respond to this. So they basically organized a ministry that was called International Friends, and it was a Cleveland-based parachurch ministry that was made up of Christians from a number of partner churches who had the vision of welcoming students and serving them. So they began by just kind of assessing the needs of students. What did they need? They needed airport pickup. They needed temporary housing when they first arrived. They needed furniture. They needed the opportunity to kind of explore the region and see Cleveland. They needed the chance to build relationships with Americans. And obviously they also needed to hear the gospel. And so that was their vision. And Tom and his wife led the ministry for many years. When he was preparing to retire, he was looking for someone else to lead the ministry and identified Art Wells, who was down serving with a larger regional international student ministry called International Friendships, Inc., IFI. That was Columbus-based and had a huge ministry to students at Ohio State. And Art was on staff there in Columbus, and when he heard about the opportunity to direct the work here in Cleveland, he and Kristen, his wife, moved up to Cleveland. They were leading the ministry for a couple years, and then that was when I was involved. My wife and I had kind of started this little outreach called Sojourn Homestays, where we were just helping Saudis primarily. We were doing what we called open tables, open rooms. Open tables where they could have meals with American families. Open rooms where we would rent out rooms in our homes to them long term. And I was feeling called to go full time into student ministry, and I was trying to decide, do I start something new or do I join with what's already in existence? And as I prayed about that, I just felt like the Lord was very clear. Join with what I've already been doing over the last few decades in Cleveland. Don't start your own. And that again speaks to that Lone Ranger. I can be a Lone Ranger sometime, and the Lord has sanctified me over the years of realizing, like, I don't need to start my own thing. Like, why not join with something,
That's good.
There's that saying, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together.
Yeah.
And so I joined with International Friendships at that time, and then Art ended up transitioning off. He's a real estate agent now. And so I ended up with the role of director of our ministry here in Cleveland. And that's a little bit about what we do. We do much the same thing as International Friendships did from the very beginning. International Friends, we welcome students. We seek to ensure that while they're here in Cleveland, they receive a warm welcome. And we try to care, the way I see it is we try to care for all of their needs. We want to care for their physical needs, if it's finding housing or getting a ride here or there, but we also want to care for their emotional, relational needs, their spiritual needs as well. So I see it as a full package. It's not like, hey, we're going to offer you a couch in hopes that you're going to come to our Bible study. Mm-hmm. That's not it's not a bait and switch. It is, we want to care for you. We want you to thrive. We want you to succeed. And we believe that part of that is we want to connect you with your Creator through Christ. But that's just a part of what we do. And I think that helps us to maintain good relationships with the student community, that they realize we're not trying to manipulate them. There's a perception of missions in a lot of these countries, such as India, where it's so interesting, the contrast of what they see versus what the American Christians see. American Christians say, we're going to go into India and we're going to care for the least of these. We are going to care for the poor, the orphaned. We're going to work in the slums, and we're going to try to provide food. We're going to invest in them, and we're going to share the gospel with them. what the other community is seeing is, oh, these Western Christians are coming in and they're paying people to become Christian. So they're going into the most vulnerable in our society, and they're saying, we'll feed you, we'll clothe you, we'll house you if you become a Christian. So that it seems very manipulative to them. And so that's where we just want to avoid any sense of we're doing this for this. This is not, we're not trying to negotiate something here. We're simply trying to care for them.
Yep. So how do you get connections with these students? Do they get assigned to you? Do you, obviously there's a relationship with the universities and colleges. So maybe just kind of use a hypothetical student, and how does that process go? What does it normally look like? If that makes sense. I don't know.
Sure. So by God's grace, we have a great relationship with universities like Cleveland State, Case Western, Lorain County Community College, Baldwin Wallace. And what they recognize is that though they are sometimes a little skeptical of us as a faith-based organization, they're concerned that we will be aggressively proselytizing or pushing something that would make their students feel uncomfortable. I think once we get past that and they realize that we're really wanting to help students just to thrive, then they, we may have opportunity to set up a table at a orientation for new students and to talk with them a little bit about what we're about and what we can offer them. And then students may attend one of our welcome parties or welcome dinners and get connected with us. And then we have a communication, both sometimes through the university, sometimes it's directly to students once we have their contact information, where they know what's going on, and they might be invited to a monthly activity, a hiking trip, a biking trip, Niagara Falls, Cedar Point, those kinds of experiences. They might be invited to sign up to have dinner in an American home. They may have an opportunity. Every year we've been doing this, we call it a fall getaway, where we take students camping for a weekend, and that's grown to be like 130 people. And so through all of those things, we're building relationships with them, and then they're also invited to what we call it either a family group or a dinner and discussion, which is where we have weekly gatherings of meals, games, and then we open the Word of God together and discuss a story from Scripture. So that's kind of the process. Some students are still asking to live with Americans, and so that's something that my wife have done and I have done for 8 years now, as we've had internationals living with us. We have 2 students with us now, one from Saudi Arabia and one from India, and that's just a normal part of our life, And when students have that need or desire to live with host, we try to find host families for them.
And you just find that out just in conversation?
Yeah, I mean,
needs or
so for example, with the housing needs, it's all word of mouth. I've never advertised. I've never promoted that in any way to students. It's all been word of mouth. Oh, you want to live with someone? Jonathan, talk to Jonathan. And students, social media is an amazing thing. The students have these WhatsApp groups of anywhere from 50 to, it could be 500 or 600 people part of the WhatsApp groups. And so they're sharing information constantly with each other. And there's Instagram, there's Snapchat. When students come on, like our fall getaway went from 17 students the first year because no one knew what to expect.
Sure.
And then everyone else was watching their Snapchats, from the weekend, and was like, wow, when that comes around, I want to do that too. And so it's just word of mouth, and it's a beautiful thing, actually.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
Great. What kind of pair these couple questions? What excites you the most about your ministry, and then probably in a very similar way, what gives you the most joy?
So you said what excites me?
What excites you the most?
Okay.
About what you're doing.
Yeah, I think one of the most exciting, and I don't know, I don't mean to oversimplify the question, because it's also one of the most joyful things for me, is when I'm able to share the gospel with a new friend, perhaps international friend, who has never talked with a Christian before and has never heard what the gospel is. Wow. That is, I mean, there are very few things that I enjoy more than that, or being invited over to a student's apartment and I'm sitting there and, there are maybe 5 or 6 guys sitting around the room. Oftentimes we're on the sofas or on the floor is common. And we're just chatting. Maybe we're having tea and dates, or maybe we're eating dinner together. And somehow the Lord opens the door to talk about Christ. And I get to correct misconceptions they have. I get to try to explain the gospel in a way that they would understand. And I think it's interesting because I mentioned my interest in the creative arts and performing arts and whatnot. And I think there's a creativity that God's given me that now, even though I'm not in the performing arts, I get to use that creativity in those conversations to try to read my audience and think, what are their questions, and how can I kind of speak into this moment right now? And so every conversation may look a little different, but I think that the Lord's given me a creativity that I love trying to get in there one way or another, with the gospel. And so that's really one of the greatest joys of my life. And I think it's underrated, and I actually feel bad for Christians who miss out on that. We can just so easily be surrounded by our kind of Christian friends, Christian community, that we are missing these opportunities of conversations to really correct misconceptions that people have, and get in there and speak the truth. Yep. Muslims have saying, that God is the most gracious and most merciful, and I really think that there's a lot of truth in Islam, and that's one of the true statements. And the problem is they don't realize how gracious and how merciful He is. He's actually far more gracious and far merciful than they ever will find in the Quran. And so that's my goal, is to show them that He's actually more glorious than they realize, and it's a gift when you get to have those conversations.
So I'm really glad that you've put it that way. That's kind of the heartbeat of no greater joy, and it does break our hearts that, for me personally, but also that we're missing out on the full joy that God has for us to step into those moments. And what might be, just kind of follow up what you were saying, what might be some of those misconceptions that you've encountered just about the gospel or Christianity? And what are some of those creative ways that you've found yourself maybe illustrating the gospel to kind of make it relatable?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Maybe the creative way that you were like, oh, that was so awesome. You were so proud of yourself in that moment, or you're just thankful that God had mercy and He brought it to your mind.
Oh man!
But what are some of the misconceptions?
Let me just give you a disclaimer first. Some of these ways I'm sure are heretical. Okay.
So we'll put it in the show notes or something. Don't listen to that.
This is all in parentheses right now.
Yeah, that's right. I've heard some people say, like, the worst heresies in the church have always come through the evangelists, because they're out there trying to explain the gospel. And they make all kinds of mistakes. So I hope these aren't too heretical. But I'll give you an example, because a lot of the work that I've done over the last 8 years now, has been with Muslims. Now it's transitioning now, and I'm having to relearn what does it look like to share the gospel with Hindus, which is a whole different world.
Sure.
And you kind of realize very quickly how much we have in common with Muslims versus Hindus, in the sense that there's a worldview there that Muslims carry that is
translatable or something.
It's very translatable. I mean, all the way from one God, one creator God who's created the world, designed the world, has an intention for the world, and that God has spoken to us through the prophets of how we are to live, what honors Him, and that God is also a God of mercy, and that God, many of the prophets that they will reference are the same prophets. They know 70% of the story,
Sure.
of Joseph and other prophets. And then also just this whole idea of, I mean, when it comes to Jesus, for example, a Muslim believes that Jesus's birth was a miracle, that it was a miraculous conception, that Mary was a virgin, that Jesus lived a perfect life, that Jesus healed the sick, raised the dead, brought the message of God, that Jesus is with God and will return again to judge the world and set things right. Like, there's a lot there to work with.
Yes.
But a Hindu doesn't really have a concept of that. So I'm still figuring out the Hindu mindset and worldview right now. I don't get it, to be honest with you. But there are bridges to the Hindu worldview, just like there are to the Muslim worldview. But I'll give you an example of one of the ideas that Muslims have is that Christians believe that there are three gods. So they believe, actually, and it's referenced in the Quran, that it's the Father, the Son, and Mary. So they were coming in contact, I think, with probably Catholic Christians who elevated Mary, and it was just misunderstood to being that Mary somehow is now part of the Trinity. So, I get to address that with them about that God is one and in three persons. Now, obviously, there's a lot of mystery surrounding that. But one of the ways that I kind of like to mess with them a little bit, you could say, is they'll say, well, that's impossible, that there would be three persons in God. And I'll ask them, so how many of you are there? And they'll say, well, one. And I'll say, really? So what will happen when your body dies? Does anything live on? Well, yeah, my spirit lives on. Okay, so are you saying that there are two of you? And then there's also the mind or the will, like the rational component of human beings, which differentiates us from animals. So I will mess with them a little bit. I want them to recognize that even within the unity of as who we are as people, there's one of us. There's also a complexity there that I think, obviously is designed by God, that there's a complexity to us, that there's a body, that there's a spirit, that there's a will or mind, rational component, and that these three make up, in some ways, one. And so I know it's slightly heretical if you dig very deep there, but the idea is I want them to recognize that there can be a complexity within oneness. And so that would be one example. Another thing is they view the reason that God would not allow Jesus to be crucified is that he would not allow his prophet or his man, so to speak, to suffer defeat in that way. And so I want them to see that actually his sacrifice was not defeat, it was victory. And so I'll talk about the reality of love. If you love someone, what is the greatest expression of that love? And usually they'll get to the point where they'll recognize it's to give your life. It's to lay down your life for someone. So does laying down your life mean that you love them less or that you love them more? It means you love them more. And it is the ultimate expression of love. And Muslims already have a concept of the beauty of God's attributes. They talk a lot about like the 99 attributes of God. So I want them to see that like God has those attributes even beyond what you can imagine, and that he has actually demonstrated his love. He has demonstrated his mercy to us through the cross and then through the resurrection, where he obviously defeats sin and death, our greatest foe. And so I want them to I'm trying to reframe that idea of defeat versus victory so that they recognize that this is the ultimate expression of God's attributes. And I love to challenge them just about, if God is both just and merciful, how can those attributes both be demonstrated simultaneously? And that is what we find in the cross, where God. And so what I find with Islam a lot of times is there's a lot of truth, but there's a lot of vague understanding of those attributes. Whereas in Christianity, what is vague and blurry over here becomes crystal clear and demonstrated through Christ. And so I always say to people, I just mentioned this yesterday to someone, like my aim is not just if someone has currency in their hand and you just rip it out of their hand and tear it apart and you say, sorry, that was fake.
Yep.
They're going to fight you, especially if they've been using that currency all their lives. But if you can say, like, okay, I know you have currency. I want to show you, I want to, maybe this framed copy of a dollar bill. Like, look at this, feel this. This is actually real currency. And then they go back and they compare it to the currency they've been using. They feel that. They feel what you have. And then at some point they may rip it up and throw it away because they recognize that it's a counterfeit. And that's really the vision that we have. Is I'm not trying to tear apart Islam. I'm not trying to insult Muhammad. I'm not trying to tell them that everything that they've ever been taught is wrong, because frankly a lot of it's right. There's a lot of truth there, and there's a lot of truth in every culture actually. But I want them to see the reality of the more glorious God that's in the pages of Scripture.
So just hearing you talk, how important is it to, and I could be really mean and be like, what's more important to know and to understand the person that you're talking to or the content that you want to share with them? I think that we could go around and around that, but how important is it to understand the person that you're sharing the gospel with?
I think it's important. I mean, I think it's important that we listen and listen. And like the reason I feel like I'm at square one with the Hindu students is because I haven't had the opportunity to listen to them unpack their kind of worldview and belief system as much as I have with Muslims, because Muslims have been living with me for 8 years. So, yeah, I think it's really important that we listen. And Tim Keller has a great line that I love where he talks about like walking the walls of someone's belief system and their life experiences, and then when you find a crack, you shove the gospel as far down in that crack as you possibly can, and then when it detonates, it makes a lot of damage. But if you just set it on the surface, if you don't know where there's the opportunity to shove it in there, it's just going to explode, and it's not going to make any real lasting difference.
Yeah, we just, in the previous episode, we're talking, I think, in a very real way, that's what Jesus was doing. The Samaritan woman with the rich young ruler and Nicodemus. Of course, he had perfect knowledge. He understood, and he put the gospel where their need was. Mm-hmm. I think that's super important. Kind of along those lines, kind of moving through our questions here. When you think about being what we would call a go person, an evangelist, however you want to put that, who in the Bible is your motivation? Who do you look to that is like, I want to be like that, and maybe why?
Yeah, I mean, Paul is right up there at the top. I mean, in Romans 15, where he says that he makes it his ambition, to take the gospel, to preach the gospel where Christ has not been named, that resonates with, I think, what God has called me to.
Mm-hmm. Is there a passage of Scripture that really you gravitate toward, that you appreciate?
I mean,
motivates you?
That's significant, Romans 10, where it talks about how will they hear, mm-hmm. unless someone is essentially sent and someone speaks and brings the gospel to them. That's been very significant to me. It's interesting, the passage that I read just before we began in Psalm 67, it's echoed that impulse of, may God be gracious to us and bless us and make his face to shine upon us, that your way may be known on earth, your saving power among all nations. I think as Christians, it's so easy for me and others to be thinking about the first part of that passage. Mm-hmm. Of course we want God to be gracious to us and bless us and to make his face shine upon us. And we stop there. And we don't see that there's this overarching storyline that's bigger than our lives, that's happening throughout all of redemptive history, that we're a part of. And when God is faithful to us, when God is gracious to us, when God is merciful to us, it's not just, that blessing is not an end in itself. It's meant to to be proclaimed, and it's meant to be shared, and it's meant to be told so that Christ receives glory among all peoples, the rightful glory. And so I remember years ago, my parents, they loved the Lord, but they were a little bit skeptical of all of this, what I was doing with internationals. And I remember my mom, it was like a Thanksgiving dinner, and I wanted to invite some internationals. And my mom said, no, I think this should just be family. And so I took this passage to her because they had taught us, we were kind of like the Von Putnam family singers as kids. My parents would parade us over to the nursing home, and we would sing, for folks, which I didn't really appreciate at the time, but I do now. And one of the songs we would sing was, may God be gracious, to you and bless you and make his face shine upon you. And then there were these like sevenfold amens,
Sure.
It'd go on and on and on.
Yeah.
But the interesting thing about that song is it doesn't go that your way may be known on earth. And so I challenged my mom, like, what is the purpose of our family? What is the purpose of these family gatherings that we have if it's a closed circle? Like, we need to use the blessing of this family to extend grace to others. And at the time, I don't think we ended up having any internationals for that particular dinner, but what's cool is my parents now are hosting students in their home, and they're on their third student, and that has lived with them for over a year each. So this is like the last 3.5 years they've had. And these guys consider my parents their parents. I meet with them, and they'll start referencing, oh, I need to talk to my mom. I need to let her know this. And I'll be like, wait, whose mom?
Right.
Are you talking
my
about,
mom?
Are you talking about my mom?
mom.
And that's I'm almost like a little, like, ugh, I don't know about this, because
Yeah,
he's
yeah.
like, and some of these guys, they get so attached to my parents, and they'll go shopping, and my parents have never been blessed as abundantly. They'll come in with just bags of gifts for my mom on her birthday or Mother's Day or something, and I'm like, oh, I got you a candle, Mom. Sorry.
It smells good.
It smells good. But anyway, it just speaks to, I think that passages like that, which are actually all over Scripture, that everything God has done, it's to bring glory to Himself among all peoples on earth, and we can miss that. So
Yep, that's good. How can people at Grace get involved with your ministry? What opportunities are there?
yeah, I mean, obviously this last year has been tricky for everyone with COVID and trying to navigate activities and serving. But I would say a couple significant ways are, we're doing monthly activities now with students, predominantly outdoor activities. And those are open for anyone who would just like to come out and see what is it like to get involved with internationals, to serve, to befriend. That they're welcome to participate in those. Those are monthly. Last month we did a winter game day at a Metro Park in Berea. There's also the opportunity to, the Craniacs have been involved recently in two ways, actually, that I'll highlight. One was in December, and at the beginning of every semester, we have an influx of students who need temporary housing. So they're landing here. They don't know anyone typically. Maybe they have had some contact with an apartment complex, but they haven't signed a lease or anything. And so they need 3 to 5 days just to buy them a little bit of time to get on the ground, to sign the lease, to schedule a move-in day, to get a little bit of furniture. And that's where having a Christian family available to take them in for that 3 to 5 days can be a huge blessing. And I think for the Craniacs, it ended up being like 14 days. But I would say that was kind of unusual. That was due to the Craniacs' generosity. Sometimes you have to give the students a boot and just say, okay, it's time. Yep. What we offer them typically is 4 days. And that is a way to begin a new relationship that will last all throughout the student's college career and maybe far beyond.
Sure.
So it's a great way to serve them.
And that's every December in July or August?
Exactly. yeah, July or August, there'll be a huge influx of students needing that kind of accommodation. And we're really just limited by the number of hosts we have.
Yeah.
There are students that would love this opportunity. Then the second thing we do these monthly activities. Last month there was a skiing event as well that the Cranics participated in for give students a chance to learn how to ski at Boston Mills Brandywine. Next month we'll be taking them to Amish country. In May we're looking to take a group of students to Florida, and we're going to stay at a YMCA camp just north of Orlando. And here, for an opportunity like that, it's a week-long trip. I recognize most people just don't have the vacation time or the energy to do something like that. But we're looking for Christians, particularly young adults or maybe young people who are just young at heart. That
College students?
College students, 100%. This would be a great opportunity to almost do a domestic mission trip.
Sure.
Because we're essentially going to pile in the van with 15 or 16 international students, and we're going to drive south, and we're going to spend a week together making memories, and we're going to have a devotion each day. And what I'm actually limited on the number of students that I can take, because I want to make sure that there's a balance of believers to non-believers, because when you start talking about Florida beaches, spring break kind of language, students have all kinds of perceptions of, oh, we're going to hit the clubs, we're going to, and obviously we don't want to do that. So I'm looking at like a 1-to-2 ratio of believer to non-believer, where we can set the culture of the trip, and we can say, hey, that's not what we're about. And we're telling people that up front, but I need people on the ground with me to help create a culture of caring, of community, of God, kind of a God-fearing atmosphere. And so I would love it to have more college students. I'd love to have more singles, 20s, 30s, and like even older, young at heart people that enjoy that kind of thing, that would want to jump in a van and go south with us. Yeah, so those are a few ways.
The dinners, hosting dinners, was that one? It has in the past, I think.
Yeah, we've done that in the past, and we will do it again probably this fall, where students can sign up to have dinner in American home. Sometimes we do that as just kind of a one or two students, one family. Sometimes we do a progressive dinner where we'll take a carload of students around to 3 different homes to get portions of their meal. That's always a lot of fun.
That's a cool idea.
Yeah.
It's a really cool idea.
Yeah. Everybody loves it. That's the thing. People, I think, are a little intimidated at first. I don't know what to say. Is it going to be awkward? I've never talked to someone who was Hindu, or I've never talked to a Muslim student, and they're just people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And when you sit down with them, and you just end up having great conversations. So
Great. Resources that have been meaningful to you, just in your own growth as a Go person. But what resources are valuable to you that you would recommend people take advantage of, or read, or listen to, or what?
yeah, that's a great question. I would say the 2 most influential pastors and leaders in my life have been John Piper and Tim Keller in terms of resources.
Mm-hmm.
Both of those guys, I think John Piper just creates the vision for the glory of God as being the central driving motivation of our lives. And then Keller, I think, is very good at breaking down culture and how, like you were mentioning earlier, what does it mean to listen to the people that you're speaking to, and then to engage them with the gospel in a way that is not just knocking people on the head with something, but is actually speaking clearly so that they're getting what you're saying. Keller has been really helpful to me in that. There are great resources in terms of sharing with Muslims. There's a book called Engaging Islam by George Husni, who's a Lebanese evangelist, that I have found to be the best resource I've found on engaging Muslims.
Right.
There are a lot of good ones. And I also would say anything on hospitality. I think hospitality is one of the most overlooked virtues, Christian virtues, that when you start seeing in all of Scripture this theme of hospitality, even from the garden, if you look at the garden as a place where God brought Adam, and it was a place of presence, where God's presence was there, and it was a place of provision, where God provided the fruit trees and for all of Adam's needs. That's a vision of hospitality the Bible begins with hospitality and it ends with hospitality, of God inviting us again to his table. And I think it's just really overlooked in our culture. I think we, in Western society, there's a syncretism? Something?
Yep. Syncretism.
Syncretism, where we see it in other cultures where we say, oh, you're merging some of your culture with the gospel. We see it in others, but we don't see it in ourselves. And there is an individualism and a self-orientation and a busyness, an emphasis on productivity rather than presence and relationship in Western society that I am convinced is utterly unbiblical. I think it's just the air we breathe, and so busyness doesn't seem to be a problem for us. But when you look at Christ, he was never hurried. There was this groundedness about him in the way he approached life, that he recognized he can't do everything, and he was in the moment with people in a way that other cultures sometimes are more comfortable with. And so I think anything on hospitality and doing hospitality well and just slowing down. There's a book I read recently called The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry, and it was helpful for me in that regard.
Great. Well, guys, any other follow-up questions maybe you want to throw out? We have some shotgun questions that are just random that we'll throw your way, just to help people get to know you a little more. Any other thing you guys want to ask?
No, I'm good. I'm ready for the shotgun.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Quick fire.
Quick fire.
You
Here
guys
we
have been
go.
quiet.
Get ready.
Just absorbing.
Yeah, just
That's
listen.
pretty good. So, favorite ice cream at Mitchell's? Mitchell's.
Oh, that used to be butter pecan, and then I'm now lactose intolerant.
Oh,
I can't
no.
handle
Oh.
it. So
Favorite sorbet
the
at Mitchell's.
the vegan salted caramel pecan is very good.
All right.
Oh.
Favorite menu item at Chipotle?
Okay, that is definitely you want to know the ingredients of it?
The whole thing, man.
The whole thing?
White or brown rice? Beans or no beans?
Definitely white rice, black beans, fajita,
Oh, he's coming.
chicken or steak, guacamole.
Burrito or bowl or salad?
I go with the burrito.
Burrito.
We feed our whole family for $17 at Chipotle. We have it down.
Wow, that's impressive.
Yeah.
That's one of my sons.
Yeah. My wife and I split a burrito. My 10 and 8-year-olds split a burrito, and then my daughter gets the kids meal, kids cheese quesadilla for $3.25.
Perfect.
$17.25 we can eat.
You got it down.
Nice.
Wow.
Favorite book of the Bible?
The Psalms.
All right. Favorite book outside of the Bible? Or we could do the one you're currently reading.
Yeah. Let me think about that for just 1 second. Okay, so Martin Lloyd-Jones' Spiritual Depression the name is terrible because
But that's what it is.
it's terrible, but it is actually about what does it mean to live as a Christian